When comedy stops being funny, the podcast crisis.
Comedy podcasts used to be about laughter. They were a space where you could sit back, hear silly stories, laugh about everyday struggles, and forget the world for a while. For years, that was their magic. They didn't pretend to be news, they didn't claim to be moral authority. They were just comedians riffing with friends, making life feel lighter for an hour or two. But over the past few years, especially through the pandemic and the 2024 election cycle, something shifted. Comedy podcasts have become political battlefields.
What started as casual conversations, maybe a stray comment about government policy here or there, has evolved into full-blown political talk shows with jokes sprinkled in. Joe Rogan is the most obvious example. For years, his podcast was a mix of UFC fighters, scientists, and absurd late-night stories. But during COVID, he turned into a daily voice for millions trying to make sense of lockdowns, mandates, and vaccines. Whether he wanted to or not, he became a political figure. And when Rogan moved to Texas and opened his comedy mothership, he turned a group of comics into what people now call the Rogan sphere. Those comedians, Theo Von, Andrew Schulz, Tim Dillon, Shane Gillis, and others, found themselves in the same spotlight. At first, it seemed like an exciting evolution. Why shouldn't comedians ask politicians tough questions? Why shouldn't they reach audiences who no longer trust CNN or Fox News? But politics is tricky. It's not like telling a joke. You can't backtrack if it doesn't land. Once you endorse a candidate, or even just let them speak unchallenged, you become part of the system. For Andrew Schulz, interviewing Trump seemed like a career-defining moment. But when Trump failed to deliver on his promises, Schulz was stuck. Should he call him out like any other politician? Or would that alienate the audience he'd just built by platforming him? Theo Von faced a different problem. Known for his rambling, funny, small-town stories, he suddenly found himself interviewing people like Bernie Sanders and Tucker Carlson. His disarming style made for entertaining conversations, but because he wasn't well-versed in policy, critics said he was being used as a propaganda tool. And then, inevitably, conspiracies started. Whispers that Theo had secret political connections or family ties to shady government operations. That's the danger. Once comedy enters politics, the audience stops laughing and starts analyzing. Every joke becomes a stance. Every guest becomes a statement. Tim Dillon has perhaps navigated this shift the best because his comedy has always been political in a satirical way. He mocks billionaires while partying with them. He rails against corruption while admitting he'd sell out in a heartbeat. His audience expects him to be both cynical and complicit. Still, even Dillon has been pulled deeper into politics, interviewing J.D. Vance and hinting at insider dinners about Epstein. It's entertaining, sure, but it's a far cry from the chaotic comedy rants that built his career. And then there are the exceptions, the podcasts that resist the pull. Bad Friends, hosted by Bobby Lee and Andrew Santino, has stayed committed to nonsense. They don't want to be political commentators. They'd rather joke about underage drinking laws in Wisconsin or make fun of each other's failures. They've said outright that bringing on politicians would ruin the show. And maybe they're right, because what people loved about comedy podcasts in the first place was that they weren't the news. The crisis of the comedy podcast isn't just about comedians chasing views. It's about what happens when laughter, one of the few things that can unite people across politics, gets swallowed up by the culture wars. Comedy was once an escape. Now it feels like another front in America's endless tribal battle. When Joe Rogan endorsed Trump on the eve of the 2024 election, millions of listeners felt validated. But when Trump failed to deliver, those same listeners felt betrayed. That's not comedy anymore. That's politics. And it's exhausting. Fans who once tuned in for silly banter now find themselves listening to debates about tariffs, wars, and conspiracy theories. Comment sections are filled not with "that bit was hilarious," but with arguments about immigration policy or vaccine safety. The joy is gone, replaced with division. Comedians, once the outsiders poking fun at power, now sit shoulder to shoulder with politicians, lending them credibility.
The irony is that laughter has always been political in its own way. Great comedians, from George Carlin to Richard Pryor, used humor to highlight injustice, but they did it on stage, in punchlines, with artistry. Today, many podcasters trade that sharpness for long-winded political rants. It's not comedy with a message, it's politics with occasional jokes. So where does this leave the future of comedy podcasts? Maybe with a lesson. The reason Bad Friends feels refreshing is because it remembers what comedy is supposed to be: silly, human, an escape. When every podcast becomes another version of CNN or Fox, we lose the one thing comedy gave us: relief. Comedy doesn't have to ignore politics, but it has to put laughter first. Because once the jokes stop, comedians aren't comedians anymore. They're just another voice in the noise. And America has more than enough of that already.